My goal would be really to end street homelessness. To end street homelessness. There'll still be people in shelters and...
We have this hotel room for you. Go into that shelter and don't be publicly visible.
Say, oh, they're just cleaning up this place because all those fancy leaders are coming into town. That's true, because it's true.
The devil sets it in your head that, like, you know what, nobody wants you. Nobody wants you at their house. Nobody wants to give you a place to stay. Nobody loves you, and look at you're in a shelter. Nobody loves you, and look at you're in a shelter.
Today, many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps.
Newsom hired like his own photographer to travel around with him, like this like Hollywood-based photographer. So that's our taxpayer dollars paying for this.
Nobody who is close to being rational would do anything like what we in Los Angeles have been doing now for close to 40 years.
The blatant thievery.
Welcome to SweptAwayLA, where we bring you the untold truths of the care crisis in Los Angeles.
We're here to shed light on the harsh realities of LA's homelessness crisis, because in the city full of stars, we can't afford to let these stories fade into the background.
We're diving deep into the issues, the policies, and the people on the front lines. The truth is here to stay, and so are we.
Stick with us as we challenge the status quo, spark real conversations, and work towards lasting solutions, because this is a crisis we can't afford to sweep under the rug.
I'm your host, NIka Soon-shiong, and I'm joined by my co-host, Ysenia.
And this is SweptAwayLA. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to SweptAwayLA, the podcast where we delve into the real struggles of homelessness in LA. I'm your host, Ysenia, and today's episode, we'll be diving into the criminalization of homelessness, the safety risks of living outside, and the systematic barriers that make it harder for people to get housed. In this episode, we'll be exploring a report by Human Rights Watch titled You Have to Move, which details how LA's approach to homelessness punishes the unhoused and pushes them further into survival mode. We'll take you through the personal stories of people living without housing, highlighting how laws and policing make it harder for them to access basic rights and safety. NIka will speak with expert and co-author of You Have to Move, John Raphling, and they'll dive into how criminalization is not just ineffective, but counterproductive, and how it feeds into a larger system of marginalization that leaves people out of sight, out of mind. He'll also explain the concept of autonomous societies and how certain groups that have tried to navigate their own survival outside of traditional systems are often criminalized as a mode of control by the government. So, let's get started. Go ahead, NIka.
Okay, John Raphling, thank you so much for joining me. Do you mind just sharing a little bit about your role and the work that you've been leading in LA County?
Thanks for having me, NIka. So I'm John Raphling. I'm a researcher at Human Rights Watch. My job title or position is researcher related to the U.S. criminal legal system, but it's expanded and is much broader because the criminal legal system touches on so many issues around race and poverty. And Human Rights Watch is a human rights organization, and that includes things like the right to housing, the right to health care, in addition to sort of the standard kind of political rights that we often think of. For background, before I came to Human Rights Watch 8 years ago, I was a lawyer, a criminal defense and civil rights lawyer, working on a lot of issues around criminalization of poverty, around police abuse and police misconduct. And before I was a lawyer, a long time ago, I was a tenant union organizer. So kind of my the work on houselessness and on criminalization of poverty kind of spans my career.
And I think for most people who haven't had those experiences, the connection between the criminal legal system and housing isn't really clear. Would you mind walking through how you see those two coming together, those two spheres?
Sure. Well, so for my first 10 years as a lawyer, I worked for the public defender's office and represented literally thousands of people accused of crimes, from the lowest level, the pettiest of petty thefts to first degree murder. And one of the things that I saw that was such a common feature of my clients was poverty. And for so many, poverty was reflected by their, let's say, housing instability. In part, that was actual houselessness, living on the streets, living in a vehicle, living in, wherever. But the other part of it was, people just didn't have a stable home. They were living on a friend's couch this week and might be staying someplace else the next week and might be in their car the week after that. And, this sort of fluid, houseless status. And seeing how much resources were put into prosecuting people who were really living in abject poverty. And so many of the crimes really came out of tensions and stress of that poverty. That it's hard not to see how much these are interrelated issues. And seeing that the criminal legal system in many ways is a management tool to manage poverty, right? So many people are out of work, and one of the things that we've done is warehouse them in prisons or put them on probation or parole so that they can be supervised and controlled, as opposed to investing in ways to uplift people from poverty or to help them uplift themselves.
And I think what stands out about that isn't just that, you're not just pointing to the cycle of poverty and incarceration, but the intent behind criminalization, particularly of the unhoused community. And you just wrote a report on this called "You Have to Move: The Cruel and Ineffective Criminalization of Unhoused People in LA." And so first, what struck me about this report is the stories and moment of people living without houses in LA, which is a skyrocketing number. And so I'm wondering, maybe just to ground us, would you mind sharing a story that stood out to you in the writing of the report?
Sure. Well, so and on background, I talked to over 100 people who lived on the streets or were currently living on the streets or had been living on the streets, and everyone has a deep and rich and generally tragic story about how they got there, and some have sort of wonderful stories about how they got themselves out of that situation. One of the stories that's featured in the report is a story of a woman named Sonia Verdugo, who's become a friend and a comrade in this work. She had a home in the Venice area of Los Angeles. She had a good job in property management. And a variety of things happened. Her husband struggled with addiction and lost his job and left her, and then she couldn't afford to keep their home, and she ended up on the streets herself. And for 6 or 7 years on the streets, getting very little help and support from the government, right? She moved into an encampment, where we see encampments all around the city, and found help and support from the people within the encampment that she lived with. Found a community and a family as such that helped protect her. And they had to deal with constant harassment from police and from the sanitation department, and getting ticketed and cited for the crime of sitting on the sidewalk or the crime of having property on the sidewalk, and constantly having to deal with the sanitation department coming and throwing everyone's stuff away, which is something in the report documents how systematic that is. Eventually, she was put in one of these hotels. Right. When COVID came about, they started moving people into hotels that were kind of like, good, right? Good to get indoors, but the hotel conditions were almost jail-like, right? Like you get searched coming in and out. You don't have your own key and come into your room whenever they want. It's not a permanent thing. And a lot of the hotels they use, particularly now, are like in really awful condition. and not allowed to have contact with other people. And so she was in the hotels for a while, and she was able to get help from uh, community organizations, what we call mutual aid organizations, which are basically just like, people who are helping out, who try to help unhoused people navigate the system. Eventually, through a federal program called Section 8, the person with a Section 8 voucher pays 30% of their income for towards rent, and the government, the voucher covers the rest of it. Eventually, she was able to get an apartment through this Section 8, and she started out, I think she said she was paying like $10 a month because she had almost no income. But then she got a job. She actually now works for one of the mutual aid organization and is busy helping other people in her former situation. And now she's paying something like $1,200 a month, right? So the investment to help her get on her feet, and now she can lock her door at night, right? Like she has that safety and security that a home gives her. She can have a shower, she can get a good night's sleep, which allows her to work and to be productive and to keep her, to keep herself grounded and her self healthy, both mental and physical health. And that's a real success story. I talked to many people who, maybe even went to the hotels and ended up back out on the streets, even got a Section 8 voucher and couldn't find a place because there was no support for them, or put themselves on lists for housing dozens of times over and over again and never heard back from the outreach and service workers. So Sonia was a success story and really an example of one of a person who really like fought for herself, but also an example of, hey, give a person a little bit of help. They can actually solve the problems.
And I think that point of how much she had to fight for herself when the system is actually stacked against her and anyone in that situation. So I often think about something we learned recently, which is that you have around 120 days to sign a lease with a Section 8 voucher like she did. But even the list of units that are available, it's outsourced to a private company that provides that list to every housing authority across the country. They only update it every 2 weeks. And so a chronic problem for people looking for affordable housing is that you're going to so many units, paying for transportation, et cetera, but they're delisted or someone's rented them already because, as we know, the market's going crazy. It's so difficult to find a unit. And so it's those small details that actually make it impossible to figure out where, who's responsible for making this process as straightforward and not putting additional barriers. And then on top of that, like you were mentioning, the constant investment in surveilling, temporary shelter.
Well, yeah, that's a complicated question, a good question and a complicated question. I mean, so the public officials often talk about, well, we've housed this many people, or we've placed these many people in housing. But they're really talking about shelter, right? Shelter takes a variety of different forms, but they call it housing, right? So shelter might be one of these, like a dorm where there's, dozens of people just laying on a patch on cots on the floor, all packed in, right? Or a shelter might be the slightly nicer shelters where you have your own sort of like an office divider, right? You have your own little space, so a little bit more privacy. Or the shelter could be these tiny homes. We call them the tool sheds, right? 8x8 with two beds, right? Two people sharing an 8x8 space. Or they could call housing these parking lots with barbed wire around them where you get searched coming in and out, and they've painted squares on the parking lot where you can set up your tent. Or the hotel rooms, or it's housing, right? So there's all these different forms of, which are essentially shelter. And while many people are helped by getting indoors, and that's good, for so many people, it's like, well, we're going to put you in a warehouse or something that is on the sort of in the direction of being like a jail. So many people would tell me, yeah, I'm not staying in those hotels. It's like being in jail. And The way I see it and wrote in the report is this is an extension of the logic of criminalization, right? So the ticketing and the sanitation destruction, it's not about solving the problem, right? It's a lot of money spent, but it doesn't get anybody housed. It just moves them somewhere, right? The title of the report, you have to move. That's what the cops come and say, you have to move, sanitation, you have to move. But also the service sector, you have to move. Hey, we have this tiny home for you. We have this shelter bed for you, right? When they do, they don't usually have them even. We have this hotel room for you, right? Go into that shelter and don't be publicly visible, right? We don't see you because we've warehoused you in this jail-like setting. And that's the short-term goal. The dominant goal is the short-term goal of let's make it look like the problem is gone by not having to see unhoused people in encampments, right? So we'll destroy an encampment, and this is Mayor Bass's inside safe, right? We'll destroy an encampment here, clear everyone out, put them in a hotel room all the way on the other side of the county. And the only reason we chose your encampment is because it's visible for everyone to see. You're not hiding. We'll throw away all your stuff, and then we'll pretend that we've housed you, whereas it's this very temporary thing, and eventually people, some do get housed permanently, but most end up back on the streets.
I think
I don't know if that answered your question.
no, it does, and I think the question of making the problem invisible while also making really visible the quote unquote problem of crime, and I'm wondering how is that a contradiction? It's at the same time as we see encampments disappear one day, we see on our TVs or newspapers somebody stealing one time, maybe something from Walmart, and all of a sudden there's more police.
Yeah, I mean, they kind of go hand in hand. And what's interesting is, like, if you look at the data, right, the crime has gone down and gone down pretty dramatically if you look at the longer term, and, it kind of spiked up at COVID time and then is kind of dropping down. But it's much more visible because anytime something happens, there's a million video cameras, and so they play it over and over again. And it's been the standard playbook of kind of law enforcement and its supporters to, you can always find a dramatic, horrible crime, right? And people's victimization is real. But then they'll take that, right? This one horrible thing that we've got an image of that we can pound the public with and use that to make policy that applies to everyone, even when it's bad policy. And so that's kind of a standard playbook that's been going on for, the 30 plus years that I've been kind of working in this area, and studying and observing these issues. So, like, for example, Prop 36 was passed, right, which kind of rolls back some, I thought, pretty good reforms or stressing treatment over punishment in, say, drug cases, and sort of de-escalating the harshness of penalties for lower level offenses. And that, that Prop 36 last fall was voted and kind of rolls back those reforms and moves us back in the direction of harsher punishments. And it was sold as this is going to help solve homelessness. Like, there's not a dime in there for housing, right? That's what solves homelessness. It's okay, so we're going to throw more people in jail. That's not really going to work.
Not a solve to homelessness, but also not a solve to, I think it brings up, what do we mean by safety, and safety for who? One of the things that really struck me in your report that counters the logic of the whole playbook you laid out is that houseless people aren't just more targeted by the police, but also some of the least physically safe in terms of homicides, reported rapes, etc. Can you describe how a highly policed group of people, police who keep us safe, would also experience high rates of violence.
Yeah, I reject your assumption that the police would keep us safe. Yeah, there's a section on victimization by crime, and unhoused people are like vastly more on the receiving end of crime, be it theft and to assault and other violence, and less likely to have those crimes solved or to have an arrest made following those crimes. And part of it is just being out and exposed, right? And part of it is the falsehood that the police actually protect people. But then on the flip side, right, and this is a data point that is really kind of shocking, is that we got data from LAPD about all the arrests and tickets that they issued, arrests and citations from 2016 to 2022. Okay. And we got them, they gave us of people that they've identified as being unhoused, right? All the arrests and citations, people that they identified as being unhoused, and matched it with a larger data set of just all arrests and citations. 38%, right? Nearly 2 in 5 arrests and citations combined were of unhoused people, right? That's maybe 1% of the population. Okay, now some of it is for more serious crimes, murders, robberies, and rapes and things like that. But most of it was, what we used to call chicken shit crime, right? I mean, like a petty theft, a drug possession, and a huge percentage of it was, drinking in public or open container, right? It's something that would not be a crime if you're doing it in your living room, but you don't have a living room, so if you're doing it in your tent, it is a crime. We found that almost 100%, it was like 99% of all open container and drinking in public charges were for people they identified as unhoused. Right, that's criminalizing a status when you do that. So the police are very proactively arresting people or citing people for these low-level crimes, including crimes like the crime of sitting on the sidewalk or having your stuff on the sidewalk, but not necessarily protecting people who are most vulnerable. And so, yeah, what does that say about public safety? Also, what does it say about, well, geez, if 1% of the population is 38% of arrests and citations, and they're all living on the streets, and so much of the things that they're getting arrested or cited for stem from their status of being unhoused. Like, maybe if we solved the underlying problem, then we wouldn't have to spend so much on all this policing, right? It goes to kind of, well, why such a big investment in the police?
And especially when, LAPD, they themselves have housing subsidies, $24,000 for new hires. Average cost of a voucher is $10,000, per year. So this question of sort of, I suppose, there's no money. There's no money. We need to pilot. We need planning. We need to figure out what works. Well, we've discussed why punishment doesn't work, but what are some things to call for that we have seen proven, that we've seen more in line with the recommendations of your report?
So a few years back, it was 2005, 2006, around then, LA County tried something. They called it Project 50. And the idea behind Project 50 was, we're going to take the 50 toughest cases, like most chronically unhoused people. And we know because they're the ones that we're spending so much on emergency room visits and, policing and prosecuting, right? Like, they know, they've identified, right? The people that are So the most burden on the county budget, because all the things that they're doing, people who are unhoused, and people who have the most trouble with mental health and addiction, and so they said, we're going to provide those people with housing and whatever services they need. It was a pilot project, right? Like, let's see how it works. And so they actually did it. I think it was like 130 some people, Project 50, but it was 130 some people. And what was interesting is everyone, like, you look at the data from the program, every single person that they reached out to with this offer accepted it, right? And sometimes maybe it took a few visits, right, to break down the "nah, you're shitting me" response when someone says we're gonna actually do something good for you. But a little bit of trust building, but everybody accepted it, right? And it worked. I forget the retention rates, right? But it worked. They got people into housing, and people stayed in the housing, and people's conditions improved. They got services. And the interesting thing, right? Like, sometimes the person starts out and they need really high level of services, right? Costly, high level intensive services. But as they get settled, that need dwindles, right? And so eventually maybe they need less. I mean, some people just are going to need services for the duration. But the point is, like, okay, there's an investment, but that pays off. And what they found in studies of it was it actually saved the county quite a bit of money, because instead of policing and emergency room visits and all this sort of kind of stopgap measures that don't actually help people, yeah, it costs some money to get people into housing and services, but it saved money on the other end with all of the sort of positive benefits. And that's just, like that's a financial value. And I don't know that they took into account the cost of the housing itself, but okay. But the value of, wow, we actually helped a person, help them get on their feet, right? Like, that's worth at least a few dollars.
And that's also, there's been other studies too in Canada for 50 people who are currently unhoused. They spent 99 more days in temporary housing, 55 more days in stable housing with just $500 a month. And reduced time in shelters saved the government around $1,000 per recipient. And so, if it's not about the money, why are we piloting things like Project 50, things like direct cash to the unhoused, when programs like Inside Safe, $350 million, 500 or so people housed permanently, it's like $500,000 per person housed. Like, why didn't we pilot that and look at the costs of that?
Yeah, well, get into Inside Safe. Just one final point on Project 50. It worked so well that, of course, they discontinued the project.
Right.
But yeah, your point as well about other studies, right? There's other things that work. A lot of people don't need services; they just need to stay in their housing, getting a little more cash into people's pockets, right? We've
To that,
talked.
yeah, we've talked about the guaranteed income aspect, but a lot of the it's not just about direct cash, it's also about the housing navigation. And so
Right.
often we find
Right.
have a great idea for how to, support somebody in looking for units or transportation. And it's already been tried in a program that ended or disbanded. And so there's a lot of excitement around what would be a successful pilot based on previous successful pilots. But it seems like we're collecting information on what would help people in sort of this temporary way that isn't making its way into permanency.
Yeah, well, and then you mentioned Inside Safe, right? Like,
Mhm.
this is a new program. It's the exact same as the old program, right? It's just stuff people into hotels after you've thrown away almost all of their stuff, after you've used
Mhm.
threats and coercion, and then people are stuck in these hotels that they're not suitable for as a permanent place to live. It's disruptive to people's lives, right? A lot of unhoused people have jobs. Like, they took down an encampment in Venice. and move people 16 miles away into hotels, right? And one of the people I talked to was like, I go to the clinic right there by where my old encampment is. Now it's like, I don't know how many different buses I need to take to get to that clinic, right? It's okay, if the hotel rooms were like a short way, a stop on the way to permanent housing, if there was actually a place for people to go, then okay, fine. Like, yeah, that's the cost of a disruption in your life. But it's going to be temporary, but it's not, right? And so many people end up, they're there and they stay there, and there's no housing navigation, as you just said. There's no housing to navigate people to. I mean, there's some, but there's not nearly enough. And so people get frustrated with having to live with all these rules in a part of town that they don't know anything about, and they leave. They end up back out on the streets. Meanwhile, we've spent $3,500 a month per person for the hotel room, which you gotta rent a pretty nice place for $3,500 a month. Anyway, and then, now the city's run out of money, so I don't even think that. Well, we'll see what happens with
Well,
that.
I mean, why, talking about the city's response, and the ways that there seems to be an anxiety or crisis over money or safety or crime as it relates to particular situations that make their way into the elected's narrative. Why did you want to launch this report now? What's important about this political moment? How can we use some of your findings to help think more clearly around what's coming?
Well, I wanted to launch the report. I worked on it for 3 years, so I wanted to launch it as soon as I could. But this is one of the most prominent issues that face us in America, and especially here in Los Angeles, which is kind of the U.S. capital of houselessness. People in San Francisco would argue that San Francisco is, but whatever. They're both centers of it. Very, immediately is we've had this Supreme Court decision that has basically given the green light to full speed ahead criminalization, and you have politicians like Governor Newsom, who basically asked the Supreme Court to make this ruling, and has come out since then saying, yes, we need to start criminalizing and moving encampments, and oh yeah, and we need to take care of people, right? Like he'll throw in some verbiage about that, and they have done some things around housing and services at the state level, but the emphasis on criminalization is really coming on strong, and the solutions that emphasize warehousing and temporary housing are gaining, as liberal politicians want to show that they're going to be tough on this issue or want to respond to, even the most liberal communities are very not liberal when it comes to affordable housing and houselessness. So that's all escalating in this moment. There's an appetite for a new conception of what our society should look like, right? And it's coming in reaction to the people in power who have a really awful vision of what our society should look like. But there is an appetite for that new vision, where we have a right to housing, where we have a right to healthcare, where we have a right to a decent standard of living, to clean water and public transportation that works and things like that. And, we have to build that.
Maybe just as a final question, for me at least, looking for the right signals that we are getting closer. It's becoming more confusing when the language seems to blur across different interventions. You mentioned, a lot of criminalization tactics and policies being marketed as forms of care. What should we be wary of?
Yeah, so there's some pictures in the report that show the sanitation department throwing people's stuff away on the back of their jackets. It says care, right? That's the program where they're throwing people's stuff away is care and care plus. So care plus destroying all your stuff. That's the language is really is often very deceptive. I mean, the biggest one is housing, right? We've housed this many people. Well, wait a second. You mean you put someone in a shelter and then they left and then you put them in a different shelter and then they left and you put them in a different shelter. And so that's 3 people you've housed, right? And none of them actually were housed. They were stuffed in a shelter for a moment, right? We want to have a right to housing. Okay, good. That's a human right that we all should have. But we define housing to include shelter, and the right to housing includes the obligation to accept whatever we offer you. So your right to housing is the right to not refuse the shelter bed that we're telling you to go into on pain of being arrested, having your stuff thrown away. The real right to housing, right? The right to housing under international human rights law and under any common sense definition is housing that's permanent, as in you live there, you have a lease, right? You're not being thrown out every afternoon or at the whim of someone else. That's habitable, right? That has amenities like running water and electricity, that's located near schools and healthcare and things like that, right? Like all the things that are actual housing. As opposed to this idea that, a painted square on a parking lot surrounded by barbed wire is somehow housing, or a dingy hotel room where you're not even allowed your own key is somehow housing. So yeah, there's a lot of this kind of, let's call it misinformation about it, or just deception, just straight up deception about what they're doing.
And I think it sort of all comes back to what Sonia said in the beginning, that the care that she really found wasn't necessarily from, the police or from the people she called, but actually from the community around her of support. So I just want to thank you for sharing her story and sharing this report with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me and listening.
Thank you for joining us here today. John Rafling's insights remind us how criminalizing the unhoused not only punishes individuals, but also exacerbates the barriers they face in trying to survive and rebuild their lives. From punitive laws to policing that fails to address the root cause of homelessness, it's clear that a new approach is needed, one rooted in compassion, safety, and the right to housing. If you'd like to learn more about John's work, or the recommendations in the report, check out the links in the show notes. We'll be back next time with more important conversations. Until then, take care and stay informed.